In war, there are moments that define the character of a nation and the spirit of its people. For the United States during World War II, one such moment came on the morning of June 4, 1942, when a handful of torpedo bombers, led by the intrepid Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, hurled themselves against the might of the Japanese carrier force at the Battle of Midway. Central to this victory was the heroic sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, a group of brave aviators who, against overwhelming odds, launched a dauntless assault on the Japanese carrier fleet. Armed with obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers and facing a formidable enemy, the men of VT-8 embodied the indomitable spirit and unwavering courage that defined the Allied forces during the war. This is the story of Torpedo Squadron 8 and of the men who gave their lives to turn the tide of the Pacific War. Torpedo Squadron 8 was formed in 1941 as part of the air group for the newly commissioned USS Hornet, CV-8, led by the seasoned and demanding Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. The squadron comprised mostly fresh, inexperienced pilots straight out of flight training. Waldron, a veteran naval aviator with a distinguished career spanning over 2 decades, immediately set about molding his raw recruits into a cohesive, combat-ready unit. He recognized the challenges that lay ahead and the limited time available to prepare his men for the rigors of war. The squadron's first aircraft were the obsolete Brewster SBN-1 dive bombers, which served as a stopgap measure while they awaited the delivery of their primary aircraft, the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber. Though a cutting-edge design when first introduced in the 1930s, the Devastator was rapidly becoming outclassed by newer, faster enemy fighters. Its slow speed and lack of defensive armament made it particularly vulnerable during the low-altitude, straight-line approach required for torpedo attacks. Nevertheless, Waldron and his men remained determined to master their craft and fight with the tools at hand. As the USS Hornet prepared to embark for the Pacific in early 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 found itself divided. A portion of the squadron, under the command of Waldron's executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Swede Larson, remained behind in Norfolk to transition to the newer and more capable TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. Waldron, eager to lead his men into combat, chose to depart with the bulk of the squadron equipped with the aging Devastators. This fateful decision would have profound consequences for the men of Torpedo 8, as they soon found themselves on the front lines of the Pacific War, facing a determined and skilled enemy. Under Waldron's strict guidance, Torpedo Squadron 8 embarked on an intensive training regimen to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. The pilots spent countless hours honing their skills in the air, practicing the demanding techniques required for successful torpedo attacks. Launching a torpedo required a delicate balance of altitude, speed, and precision. Too high, and the torpedo would shatter upon impact with the water. Too low, and it would plunge straight to the depths. The ideal launch window was a narrow one, requiring the pilot to approach the target ship at an altitude of approximately 100 feet and a speed of less than 120 knots. Throughout the approach, the aircraft would be exposed to withering enemy fire, requiring nerves of steel and unwavering focus. On the ground, the squadron immersed themselves in the study of enemy tactics, ships, and aircraft. They pored over intelligence reports and reconnaissance photos, committing to memory the silhouettes and characteristics of Japanese vessels and fighters. The pilots, gunners, and radio men drilled ceaselessly on their roles and responsibilities, knowing that seamless coordination and communication would be essential in the chaos of battle. They practiced emergency procedures, such as rapidly escaping a crippled aircraft in the event of a crash landing at sea, until these drills became second nature. Waldron's leadership during this critical period was instrumental in forging the squadron into a tight-knit, well-oiled machine. He led by example, demonstrating an unwavering commitment to excellence and a deep concern for the well-being of his men. He tirelessly advocated for their needs, ensuring they had the best possible equipment and resources to carry out their missions. Despite his gruff exterior and exacting standards, Waldron earned the respect and loyalty of his pilots, who came to affectionately refer to him as Skipper. As the USS Hornet steamed towards the Central Pacific in May 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 stood ready to face the ultimate test of their skills and courage. Little did they know that their mettle would soon be put to the most severe trial imaginable, in a battle that would determine the fate of nations and forever cement their place in the annals of military history. As the war in the Pacific progressed, the Japanese Naval Command devised a plan to extend their defensive perimeter and lure the remaining US carriers into a decisive battle. The strategy involved a diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, while the main force would attack and occupy Midway Atoll. By securing Midway, the Japanese hoped to create a buffer zone to protect their home islands and draw the US Pacific Fleet into a trap. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, American naval intelligence had cracked their JN-25 communication code. The US codebreakers, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo in Hawaii, intercepted messages revealing the impending attack on Midway. To confirm Midway as the target, the Americans devised a clever ruse. They broadcasted a false message indicating that Midway's water purification system had broken down. When the Japanese intercepted and relayed this message using the code word AF for Midway, the Americans knew that Midway was indeed the target. Armed with this crucial information, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, prepared to ambush the Japanese at Midway. He dispatched his available carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, to positions northeast of the atoll. Nimitz's plan relied on surprise and coordinated attacks from various aircraft types: fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. As the Japanese combined fleet, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, steamed towards Midway, they remained unaware that the Americans had deciphered their plans. The Japanese force, divided into several groups, included 4 large fleet carriers led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo, who had masterminded the Pearl Harbor attack, planned to strike Midway from the northwest and then destroy any American ships that came to the atoll's defense. Meanwhile, on the American side, last-minute preparations were underway. The USS Hornet, with Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard, hastily set sail from Pearl Harbor to join the Enterprise and Yorktown. In a tragic twist of fate, the Hornet's departure was so rushed that the squadron's new Grumman TBF Avengers, which were supposed to replace their obsolete Devastators, did not arrive in time. Consequently, VT-8 would have to face the Japanese with their outdated planes. As the two fleets converged on Midway, tension mounted. The Americans, relying on their intelligence advantage, positioned themselves to strike first. The Japanese, confident in their superiority and unaware of the impending ambush, continued their advance. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War. On the eve of the Battle of Midway, the American carriers and their air groups made final preparations. Aboard the USS Hornet, a fierce debate erupted between Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leader of VT-8, and the commander of the Hornet's air group, Stanhope Ring. Waldron, acutely aware of the Devastator's vulnerabilities, argued vehemently for fighter protection for his torpedo planes during the impending attack. Ring, however, favored a different approach. believing that the fighters should remain at high altitude with the dive bombers to draw away the Japanese combat air patrol. Waldron, drawing on his experience and understanding of torpedo plane tactics, knew that without fighter escort, his slow, poorly armed devastators would be easy prey for the fast, maneuverable Japanese Zeros. He passionately pleaded his case, emphasizing the need for a coordinated attack that would give his squadron a fighting chance. Ring, however, was unmoved. He insisted on following the original plan, which called for the torpedo planes to attack independently at low altitude. As the argument reached a boiling point, Waldron made a fateful decision. If Ring would not provide fighter cover, VT-8 would attack alone. Waldron informed his pilots that regardless of the consequences, they would press on with their mission. He emphasized the importance of their role in the overall battle plan and encouraged them to do their utmost to strike the enemy carriers. While Waldron and Ring clashed over tactics, the pilots of VT-8 made their own preparations. They studied intelligence reports, memorized the profiles of Japanese ships, and discussed potential attack routes. Ensign George Gay, one of the squadron's youngest pilots, later recalled the somber atmosphere in the ready room. The men knew the odds were stacked against them, but they were determined to do their duty. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the American carriers launched their aircraft to search for the Japanese fleet. The Hornets Air Group, including VT-8, took off with orders to locate and attack the enemy carriers. As the planes flew towards their designated search areas, Waldron became increasingly convinced that the Japanese had changed course. He radioed Ring, urging him to alter the flight path to intercept the enemy. Ring, however, refused to deviate from the plan. Frustrated and concerned for his men's safety, Waldron made a bold decision. He broke radio silence and signaled his squadron to follow him. Veering away from the Hornets Air Group, Waldron led VT-8 on a course he believed would take them directly to the Japanese carriers. This fateful choice would have profound consequences for the squadron and the battle's outcome. As VT-8 pressed on alone, the other American squadrons searched in vain for the enemy fleet. Unbeknownst to them, Waldron's instincts had been correct. He had successfully deduced the Japanese position and was leading his men straight into the jaws of the enemy. Without fighter protection and armed only with their obsolete devastators, the men of VT-8 prepared to face their destiny. On the Japanese side, Admiral Nagumo's carriers were busy preparing to launch a strike against the American base on Midway. Japan, arrogantly assured by their strategic approach, were unaware of the approaching danger. As VT-8 closed in on their position, the stage was set for a clash that would test the mettle of Waldron and his men, and ultimately shape the course of the Battle of Midway. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, the calm of the Central Pacific was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines and the crackle of radio transmissions. The Japanese carrier fleet, under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had been spotted by American reconnaissance planes some 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The USS Hornet, along with her sister carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, had been dispatched to intercept and engage the enemy. For the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, the moment they had trained for had finally arrived. In the pre-dawn darkness, the pilots and aircrew gathered in the ready room, a palpable tension filling the air. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, the squadron's leader, briefed his men on the latest intelligence and the plan of attack. The Japanese fleet was believed to consist of 4 carriers, each heavily defended by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Waldron's squadron, along with the torpedo squadrons from the other American carriers, would be tasked with launching a low-level attack on the enemy carriers, braving a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of deadly Zero fighters. As the pilots made their way to their aircraft, Waldron took a moment to address his men one final time. His words, captured in a brief diary entry, would become the stuff of legend.
My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give 'em hell.
With those stirring words ringing in their ears, the pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 climbed into their Devastators and prepared for takeoff. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they were determined to do their duty and strike a blow against the enemy, no matter what the cost. As the first rays of sun began to paint the horizon, the squadron launched from the Hornet's deck and set course for their rendezvous with destiny. As Torpedo Squadron 8 winged its way towards the Japanese fleet, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron faced a momentous decision. The original plan, as outlined by the Hornet's Air Group Commander, called for a coordinated attack by the torpedo squadrons, dive bombers and fighters from all three American carriers. The fighters were to provide cover for the slower, more vulnerable torpedo planes, while the dive bombers would strike the enemy carriers from above. However, as the morning unfolded, it became clear that this carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling. Waldron, flying at the head of his squadron, grew increasingly concerned as the minutes ticked by with no sign of the other American aircraft. The Hornets, dive bombers and fighters, led by Commander Stanhope C. Ring, had become separated from the torpedo squadron and were nowhere to be seen. Waldron faced a difficult choice. Should he follow the original plan and continue searching for the other American planes, or should he press on with the attack alone, knowing that his squadron would be unprotected and vulnerable? For Waldron, there was no question. He was a man of action, deeply committed to his duty and the success of the mission. He knew that every minute spent searching for the other American aircraft was a minute that the Japanese carriers would have to launch their own devastating strikes against the US fleet. With a heavy heart, Waldron made the decision to continue the attack, even if it meant sacrificing his own squadron. Radioing his intentions to his pilots, Waldron set a course for the last known position of the Japanese fleet. He knew they would be facing an onslaught of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but he remained resolute in his determination to press home the attack. His men, trusting in his leadership and inspired by his courage, followed him without hesitation. As the squadron approached the enemy fleet, they were met by a swarm of Zero fighters, which pounced on the slow, lumbering Devastators with ruthless efficiency. Waldron, leading from the front, was among the first to be hit. His aircraft, riddled with bullets and trailing smoke, plunged into the sea, taking the squadron commander with it. But even in his final moments, Waldron's thoughts were with his men. His last radio transmission, captured by a nearby pilot, was a simple, poignant message.
My 2 wingmen are going into the water.
Waldron's sacrifice and the courage of the men who followed him would not be in vain. Their attack, while costly, would play a crucial role in the ultimate victory at Midway. By drawing the Japanese fighters down to wave top level and disrupting the enemy's defenses, Torpedo Squadron 8 paved the way for the devastating dive bomber attacks that would follow, sealing the fate of the Japanese carrier fleet and turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. As Torpedo Squadron 8 pressed on towards the Japanese fleet, the full weight of their perilous situation became increasingly apparent. Without fighter escort, the slow, outdated Devastators were virtually defenseless against the swarms of nimble Japanese Zero fighters that now rose to meet them. The squadron's only hope lay in pressing home their attack with grim determination, knowing that their sacrifice might buy precious time for the dive bombers and fighters that followed. The first sign of trouble came when Lieutenant Commander Waldron's plane was hit, sending it plunging into the sea in a trail of smoke and flame. The loss of their leader was a devastating blow, but the men of Torpedo 8 did not falter. They knew that Waldron would have wanted them to press on no matter the cost. As the Zeros tore into the formation, the air was filled with the chatter of machine guns and the desperate calls of stricken pilots. The Devastators, with their lumbering speed and limited maneuverability, made easy targets for the nimble Japanese fighters. One by one, the American planes were hit, their fuel tanks punctured, and their crews wounded or killed. Yet, incredibly, the pilots of Torpedo 8 refused to break off their attack. With unwavering courage, they held their course, flying straight into the teeth of the enemy defenses. They knew that their torpedoes had to be launched from a low altitude and at close range, making them incredibly vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ships. As the planes closed in on their targets, the sky around them erupted in a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. The Japanese ships, alerted to the impending attack, unleashed a barrage of anti-aircraft fire that churned the sea into a froth of boiling water and jagged metal. The Devastators, already riddled with bullets from the Zeros, flew on through this wall of flak, their pilots grimly determined to release their torpedoes at point-blank range. One by one, the planes of Torpedo 8 made their final desperate runs. Some were shot down before they could even launch their torpedoes, their crews consumed in fiery explosions that lit up the morning sky. Others managed to release their fish before being torn apart by enemy fire, their pilots clinging to life just long enough to see their torpedoes streak towards the enemy ships. In the end, not a single torpedo found its mark. The Japanese carriers, alerted to the danger, were able to maneuver out of harm's way, their skilled crews working frantically to evade the incoming missiles. But even in defeat, the men of Torpedo 8 had achieved a vital objective. Their selfless sacrifice had drawn the Japanese fighters down to the deck, leaving the skies above the enemy fleet unguarded and vulnerable. As the last Devastator vanished beneath the waves, the stage was set for the dive bombers and fighters that followed. Thanks to the courage and determination of Torpedo 8, these planes would find the Japanese carriers exposed and defenseless, their decks cluttered with planes and bombs in the space of just a few minutes. The course of the battle and the war would be forever changed. Amidst the chaos and carnage of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack on the Japanese fleet, one man's story of survival stands out as a testament to the resilience and fortitude of the human spirit. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of his squadron, would live to tell the tale of his comrade's sacrifice and the incredible events that followed. Gay, flying at the rear of the formation, watched in horror as his fellow pilots were cut down one by one by the relentless Japanese fighters. His own plane, hit multiple times, was rapidly losing power and becoming difficult to control. Yet Gay, like his comrades, refused to turn back. With grim determination, he pressed on towards the Japanese carriers, determined to release his torpedo at any cost. As Gay closed in on his target, his plane was suddenly rocked by a massive explosion. A Japanese shell had struck the Devastator, tearing through the fuselage and killing Gay's gunner instantly. Badly wounded and with his plane now a flaming wreck, Gay knew he had only moments to act. With a superhuman effort, Gay wrenched the plane into a steep dive, aiming for the churning sea below. Just before impact, he released his torpedo, watching as it streaked towards the enemy carrier. Then, with barely seconds to spare, Gay pulled the release lever on his canopy and was thrown clear of the doomed plane. As Gay struck the water, he was suddenly enveloped in a world of pain and chaos. His left arm, hit by shrapnel, was badly mangled, and his life jacket had been torn away by the force of the impact. Struggling to stay afloat, Gay watched as the last of his squadron mates were shot down, their planes vanishing into the sea in balls of fire. For hours, Gay drifted in and out of consciousness, clinging to a small rubber raft that had miraculously survived the crash. Around him, the battle raged on, the sky filled with the roar of engines and the crackle of gunfire. But Gay, alone and badly wounded, could do nothing but watch and wait. Incredibly, as night fell, Gay was spotted by an American search plane. The pilot, seeing the downed aviator's plight, dropped a life raft and radioed his position to the fleet. Hours later, as dawn broke over the Pacific, Gay was finally rescued by a Navy destroyer, his ordeal at an end. Gay's story, one of courage, sacrifice, and incredible fortune in an otherwise tragically unfortunate series of events, would become an enduring symbol of the spirit of Torpedo Squadron 8. His survival, against all odds, served as a testament to the bravery and determination of his fallen comrades, and a reminder of the incredible sacrifices made by so many in the defense of freedom. The impact of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice on the outcome of the Battle of Midway cannot be overstated. While their attack did not result in any direct hits on the Japanese carriers, their bravery and determination played a crucial role in the ultimate American victory by drawing the Japanese fighters down to wave top level and disrupting the enemy's defenses. Torpedo 8 had opened the way for the dive bombers that followed. In the space of just a few minutes, these planes, arriving over the enemy fleet unopposed, were able to score devastating hits on 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, turning the tide of the battle in favor of the Americans. The loss of these carriers was a crippling blow to the Japanese Navy, one from which it would never fully recover. Without air cover, the remaining Japanese ships were forced to retreat, their hopes of a decisive victory against the American fleet dashed. The Battle of Midway, which had begun with the Japanese on the offensive, ended in a stunning defeat that would mark a turning point in the Pacific War. For the men of Torpedo 8, the cost of this victory was unimaginably high. Of the 30 aviators who had set out that morning, only one, Ensign George Gay, would survive. The rest, including Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had given their lives in the defense of their country, their sacrifice forever etched into the annals of American naval history. In the aftermath of the battle, the story of Torpedo 8's bravery spread quickly, inspiring Americans on the home front and serving as a rallying cry for a nation at war. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds became a symbol of the indomitable American spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and determination could prevail. For the families of the fallen, the loss of their loved ones was a burden too heavy to bear. But in the years that followed, they would find solace in the knowledge that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The men of Torpedo 8, through their selfless actions, had helped to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific, bringing victory and peace closer for millions of Americans.